So in the world of music recording, audio hardware, and I'd say especially among synthesizer and pedal junkies, the analog tape delay unit is highly coveted, not just for its sound, but definitely for its pose value. The Roland RE201 is probably the most famous of these units. Univox also made the Echo Chamber 80A and Korg's very own SE300 Stage Echo, name a few of the time. But guys, I actually have a confession. I really hate vintage hardware. Yes, I know I've said this many times throughout my years, but I've owned vintage synths like GX3Ps, Juno 106s, a sequential multitrack, plus more, and every single one brought more headaches than creative inspiration. Thus, they were eventually all sold. Recently, though, I had a moment of extreme weakness, a moment of pure impulse. I relapsed. There was this one vintage piece that I always wanted, that effect that was used on countless hit records, coveted by many, owned by few, and maybe for good reason. While browsing Craigslist the other day, I came across a post, an RE150 Space Echo. And worst of all, the seller was only 5 minutes drive from my house. The ad said 500, but I said, I'll do 400 cash. It could be the steal of a lifetime, but there's a catch. It's noisy. Some delay modes have additional hum. The connection on some of the jacks is hit or miss. The attenuation slider is non-existent, and the volume knob is out of whack. Best of all, when I reached out to a well-known analog repair company in Los Angeles, they said they just don't fix Space Echoes anymore. They're just too unreliable, even after repair. But let's go back. There's some history behind this little box. I've talked about this guy before, but it all began with Ikutaro Kakahashi and this design, the Acetone EC1 Echo Chamber in the late 1960s, with the EC10 and EC20 to follow. In 1973, Ikutaro Kakahashi had ceased operation under the brand name Acetone and began producing new models of tape echo machines under the new company, the Roland Corporation. The very first Space Echo machine produced was the RE100 Space Echo, and like earlier Acetone machines, the RE100 featured multiple playback heads, but also had bass and treble tone controls. This allowed the user to shape the tone of the repeats, and these features alone put the RE100 ahead of the rest of the market. I'm sure you've all seen it before, but the most famous Space Echo of all time is likely the venerable RE201, which featured circuit upgrades that improved the overall tone of the machine. The truly ahead of its time feature was the tape transport mechanism. The RE201 tape transport mechanism used only a single cap stand for transport and left the quarter-inch tape freely floating within the tape chamber. This design not only improved the tonal fidelity of the repeats, but it also provided a much greater reliability than the machines before it. The RE201 was the only tape machine of the time that could handle the rigors of the road. Thus, the RE201 was a hit and remained in production until 1990. Following the RE201 was the RE301, and it was distinguished by adding two new features. The first was a lush analog chorus effect that was able to be concurrently used or independently from the delay effect. Additionally, you had sound-on-sound mode on the 301, which allowed users to loop phrases. Essentially, it was a looping pedal, it was a looping box, big box. The model I have is the Roland RE150, which was marketed as a value price alternative to the RE201. Although it looked very similar to the RE101 and contained many of the same circuitry and mechanisms, the RE150 differed as that it only had two playback heads, so that was one less than the 201, limiting the number of mode variations available to the user. But like the Rode RE101, it lacked reverb. Interestingly, the RE150 had a unique feature where you could only have the direct dry signal, or you could have the direct wet signal. And I personally love this. This really lets me use this perfectly as a hardware insert in my DAW. Finally, the Roland RE501 and SRE555. They proved to be the last tape-based design that Roland ever created, and that was around 1982, which was 40 years ago. While I love that I bought a Space Echo after all these years, honestly, it's a big heavy box that makes noise and doesn't always perform at its best. It's truly the epitome of ghost in the machine. When it's doing things the right way, there's nothing like it, but the frustration of its function or non-function will kill your creative flow for sure. Expensive alternatives are accessible, but I use that word extremely lightly, as these can be upwards of $2,000 from a company maybe like EchoFix. So take it from me. I'd personally say my alternative, if you want to dive into the analog but don't want to dive into the problems that something like a vintage Space Echo is almost surely going to give you, is a way huge Supa Puss. I've had mine for years, and it can go from very clean repeats to crunchy repeats. It very much gives you the vibe of the Space Echo. If you use the depth, you can get those tape flutter type effects. So I kind of said all this just to ask myself a question. If I could go back in time, would I buy another 40-year-old vintage Roland Space Echo? And the answer is no. It's way more fun to look at than it is to practically use. Anyways, like, subscribe, Instagram and Twitter. Check out my album Mom It's Me on Bandcamp, Spotify. I'm out.